There is a corridor inside the Great Pyramid of Giza that no person has physically stepped inside. Not a passage that archaeologists forgot to check. Not a tunnel blocked by a rockfall that nobody bothered to clear. A sealed space. Deliberate and precise. Hidden behind a wall of limestone that was placed there 4,500 years ago and not physically entered since. The ancient Egyptians built it. They sealed it. And then they walked away. And time covered their tracks. And the centuries came and went. And every civilization that rose and fell in the time between then and now never knew the corridor was there. In 2023, a team of researchers finally brought back the first images from inside it. Not by breaking through the stone. Not by drilling or blasting or any of the methods that earlier explorers had used to force the pyramid to give up its secrets. They sent a camera through a gap no wider than a finger. And for the first time in modern history, images came back from a space that had been sealed since before the alphabet existed. What those images showed is part of this story. But it is not the most important part. Tonight we are going to walk toward that corridor together. Slowly. The way you approach something that has been waiting a very long time. Because the corridor itself, the stone and the sand and the darkness inside it, is not where this story lives. This story lives in the people who built it. In a man named Mirror, who kept a shipping journal 4,500 years ago and whose words survived in a sealed cave on the coast of the Red Sea long enough for us to read them. In the workers whose names were painted in red ochre on stones that were never meant to be seen. In the physicists who learned to read the shadows that particles from outer space cast through 2 million blocks of ancient rock. In everyone who has stood at the base of this structure and felt, without being able to fully explain why, that there was more inside it than anyone had confirmed. There was always more inside it. Tonight, we are going to find out how much more. Settle in. Let your breathing slow. You do not need to hold on tightly. The story will carry you. The pyramid has been waiting 4,500 years. And so has the question it was built to ask. Chapter 1. The Pyramid You Think You Know. Picture the number 2.3 million. Not as an abstraction, as individual stones. Each one quarried from the earth by human hands. Shaped by human hands. Transported by human hands. And placed with a precision that a level placed across the finished base would confirm to within less than 2 inches across 13 acres of ground. 2 inches. Across 13 acres. 4,500 years ago. Take a moment with that before we go any further. Because the tendency, when we talk about the Great Pyramid of Giza, is to move past the facts too quickly, to absorb them as impressive, and then keep going. As though impressive were a category that could be filed away and set aside. The facts of the Great Pyramid do not belong in that category. They belong in the category of things that, when you actually stop and sit with them, refuse to resolve into something comfortable and familiar. The base of the pyramid covers approximately 13 acres of ground and is level to within less than 2 inches across its entire surface. The 4 sides are aligned to the cardinal directions, with an accuracy of less than 1/10 of a degree. The 4 corners are almost perfect right angles, within a fraction of a degree of 90 degrees each. The structure contains an estimated 2.3 million stone blocks, with an average weight of around 2.5 tons each, and some of the granite blocks used in the interior chambers weighing as much as 80 tons. It was built during the reign of a pharaoh named Khufu, who ruled Egypt during what historians call the Old Kingdom. In a period beginning around 2500 BCE, it is the oldest of the 7 wonders of the ancient world and the only one still standing, for nearly 4,000 years, from the time it was completed until the construction of the Lincoln Cathedral in England in the year 1111 CE. It was the tallest structure human beings had ever built. You probably knew some version of those facts. Here is what is easy to forget. The level of planning and precision the pyramid's builders achieved still demands explanation. Not in the supernatural sense. Not in the way that requires alien intervention or lost technology from a vanished supercivilization. In the way that requires us to accept something more interesting and more difficult to hold on to. That the people who built this structure understood things about large-scale construction, about surveying and logistics and the coordination of human effort at scale. That the civilizations, which came after them, did not inherit intact. That loss is part of this story. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. What do we actually know about the interior? The answer most people carry goes something like this. The pyramid contains 3 main chambers. At the bottom, cut into the bedrock beneath the pyramid, is a space that was apparently never finished, which archaeologists call the subterranean chamber. Above it, reached by a long ascending passage, is a room called the Queen's Chamber. Though it has no confirmed connection to any queen and its actual purpose remains debated among scholars. And at the top of a soaring interior gallery called the Grand Gallery, at the very heart of the pyramid, is the King's Chamber, a room of polished red granite containing a single open stone sarcophagus. 3 chambers, a sarcophagus, a pyramid built as a tomb for a pharaoh. Clean, orderly. The kind of sentence that fits on a museum placard. Also, seriously incomplete. Because those 3 chambers are what had been confirmed as of the year 2015. And between 2015 and 2023, the story changed. Not dramatically. Not in the way that overturns everything, but in the way that genuinely new knowledge always changes things. By adding something that was not there before. Something that requires the old picture to expand, to accommodate it. Before we get to what was found, we need to understand something about the history of looking. Because people have been searching the interior of the Great Pyramid for a very long time, and that history is full of ambition and error, and the particular kind of humility that only comes from being repeatedly wrong about something you were certain you had figured out. But, before the history of looking, we need to meet the people who built what everyone has been looking inside. Because they are the part of this story that gets lost most easily. They get buried under the weight of the monument they left behind. They become abstract, almost inhuman in their achievements. And when that happens, we lose something essential. We lose the fact that every stone in that pyramid was touched by human hands. Every single one. Chapter 2. The Builders We Got Wrong. There is a man whose name was Merer. We know this because he wrote it down. Acts 4,500 years ago. On sheets of papyrus. In a journal that he kept with the care of someone who understood that accurate records mattered. Merer recorded the daily operations of his working life. The deliveries he made, the routes he traveled, the names of his colleagues, the delays caused by weather and logistics, the rhythm of days organized around a single, enormous task. He was a mid-level official, responsible for a team of around 200 men on the transport runs, he recorded. Men whose job was to ferry limestone from the quarries at Tura, across the Nile, to the construction site, at a place whose official name was not a word, meaning tomb. It was the horizon of Khufu. The horizon is where the sun rises and sets, the boundary between this world and what lies beyond it. At least, that is what the word suggests to us across the distance of time. And the man ferrying stone to that structure was keeping careful records of his shipping schedules, writing them down on papyrus that would survive 4,500 years in a sealed cave on the coast of the Red Sea, waiting for a French archaeologist named Pierre Talat to find them in 2013. Talat published his full analysis in 2021. The implications were extraordinary. Not just because the documents were among the oldest papyrus texts ever found, but because of what they contained. We know the rhythm of Merer's working days. We know when his boats were late. We know the names of some of his colleagues. We know that he was careful with his records, and that the name he used for what he was building pointed not toward storage or burial but toward transition. A horizon. A threshold, a place where something passed from one state of existence to another. Hold that image. We will come back to it. Before Merer's papyrus was found, the story told about the pyramids' builders was a different one. It was the story of slaves. Tens of thousands of them worked to death under the whips of overseers, dragging stones across the desert under a merciless sun. Their suffering, the hidden foundation beneath one of the greatest monuments in human history. That story appears in ancient texts, in films, in textbooks. It has the quality of something that feels true because it fits a familiar moral shape. It is not supported by the evidence. In 1990, a construction worker near the Giza Plateau accidentally broke through into a network of tombs that no one knew was there. Archaeologist Zahi Hawass led the subsequent excavation. What his team found was a workers' village, a permanent settlement built specifically to house the people who constructed the pyramids. It contained bakeries and breweries, scaled to feed large numbers of people. It contained administrative buildings. It contained a hospital, with evidence of medical care, including the setting of broken bones and, in at least one case, the amputation of a limb that the patient survived. The people buried in the tombs adjacent to the village were buried with dignity. Their graves contained offerings. Some of them were buried close to the pyramid itself, an honor that would not have been extended to slaves. The physical evidence from the skeletons told its own story. These were people who performed extremely heavy labor over long periods of time. Their bones show the kind of wear that comes from a lifetime of lifting and carrying enormous weights. But they also show evidence of recovery from injuries, of medical care, of people who were kept alive and treated when they were hurt rather than simply discarded. They were workers, organized workers, workers who received food and housing and medical attention and, when they died, burial with the kind of care that suggests someone valued their lives. That distinction matters enormously for how we understand the pyramid. A structure built by coerced labor under conditions of terror tells one story about the civilization that built it. A structure built by an organized, fed, housed, and medically cared-for workforce tells a completely different story. It tells a story about administrative capacity, about logistical sophistication, about the ability to coordinate thousands of people across years of sustained effort in ways that required something other than fear as the organizing principle. Merer's journal is the clearest window we have into what that organizing principle looked like in practice. He writes about loading the boats, about the Nile's current, about deliveries made and deliveries scheduled, about the movement of his team from one location to another across a logistics network that spanned hundreds of miles. He does not write about suffering or compulsion. He writes about work, the same way a professional writes about work in any era, with attention to the details that matter and the quiet satisfaction of tasks completed accurately. He mentions delivering stone to the horizon of Khufu the way a supply chain manager might log a delivery to a construction site. Matter-of-factly, as a detail among many other details, as something important enough to record precisely but not so extraordinary that it requires special comment, he was delivering stone to the most ambitious construction project in the history of the world. And he wrote about it, the way you write about doing your job well. That is the human being inside the monument. That is what gets lost when the pyramid becomes a symbol rather than a fact. The man with the boats and the journal and the careful records, doing his job, day after day. On the river, beneath the structure rising on the opposite bank, he will appear again in this story, because his journal and the structure he helped build, and the sealed corridor that no one knew existed until 2023, are all part of the same thing. They are all evidence of a civilization that understood. at a level of practical sophistication we have not fully recovered. What it meant to build something intended to outlast not just a human life, but time itself. The question of how they built it, how they moved those 80-ton granite blocks from the quarries at Aswan, 800 miles to the south, and lifted them into position inside a rising structure, remains genuinely open. The tools, sledges, ropes, surveying methods, and accumulated expertise that allowed the builders to achieve what they achieved at Giza represent one of the great unsolved questions of ancient engineering. Jean-Pierre Houdin, a French architect, proposed in 2007 that the pyramid was built using a combination of an external ramp for the lower courses and an internal spiral ramp running just inside the outer casing for the upper portions. If his theory is correct, there are passages inside the pyramid that have not yet been found. That possibility is one of the reasons the story we are telling tonight matters. The pyramid is not a solved problem. It is an ongoing conversation between the structure and the people who study it. And the people who study it right now have tools that no previous generation had. But before we get to those tools, we need to understand the long and strange tradition they were working in. The tradition of people who looked at the Great Pyramid and understood, before they could fully articulate it, that there was more inside it than anyone had confirmed. Chapter 3. The Architecture of Secrets. The Great Pyramid has been inviting intrusion for almost as long as it has been standing. Not because it announces its secrets. Quite the opposite. Its exterior, stripped now of most of the white limestone casing that once covered it, presents a surface of stepped stone that reveals no entrances, no openings, no indication of what lies within. The original casing, when intact, was even less revealing. A smooth white surface, polished to a reflectivity that ancient writers compared to a mirror, offering no handhold and no hint of a way in. The ancient Egyptians understood security through concealment. The royal tombs that preceded the Pyramid Age had been robbed within generations of being sealed. The robbers knew the layouts. In some cases, archaeologists believe they were the same people who had built the tombs, who had memorized the floor plans during construction and simply waited for the right moment. So the designers of the Great Pyramid hid the entrance. The original entrance is on the north face, approximately 17 meters above the base. In its original state, it was concealed behind a casing block indistinguishable from the surrounding surface. That concealment worked for centuries. It was discovered in the 9th century, when a caliph named Abdullah al-Mamun ordered his workers to break into the pyramid in search of treasure. Al-Mamun was a serious intellectual, a patron of science who established one of the great libraries of the medieval world in Baghdad. He believed the pyramid contained maps of the heavens and possibly gold. His workers started digging into the north face. They tunneled through the limestone for weeks, finding nothing. They were about to give up when they heard a stone fall somewhere ahead of them in the darkness. They dug toward the sound and broke through into the descending passage, the original corridor that slopes downward from the pyramid's north face into the bedrock below. Al-Mamun's workers followed the passages to all 3 of the known chambers. In the king's chamber, they found the granite sarcophagus. It was empty. No treasure, no mummies, no maps of the heavens. The emptiness of that chamber has never been satisfactorily explained. We will return to it. For now, the important thing is that Al-Mamun's expedition established the basic layout of the interior as it was understood for the next 1,000 years. 3 chambers, a sarcophagus, a lot of empty space and unanswered questions. The next major chapter in the interior's exploration came in 1837, and it came with considerably less finesse than modern archaeology would prefer. A British military officer named Howard Vyse arrived at Giza with a conviction and a quantity of gunpowder that he was not shy about using. Weiss had become convinced, based on the interior measurements, that there was more space above the king's chamber than the known structure could account for. He was right. Above the king's chamber, reached by a narrow crack that Weiss widened with explosives, his team found a series of low compartments stacked on top of each other. There are 5 of them, each with a flat granite ceiling and a rough, unfinished floor, ending at the top in a pointed, gabled ceiling of enormous limestone blocks. These spaces are now called the relieving chambers, on the theory that could the Great Pyramid above the king's chamber. In the lowest of these spaces, Weiss found something painted on the rough granite blocks in red ochre. The names of the work gangs who had placed the stones. One of those names contained a cartouche, an oval frame used to enclose royal names, and within it the name of Khufu. It was the first time the name of the pyramid's builder had been found inside the pyramid itself. Weiss was accused, later, of having forged the inscription. The accusation was made most forcefully by a writer named Zechariah Sitchin, who had a large popular following but was not a professional Egyptologist. Mainstream Egyptology has examined the evidence carefully and does not accept Sitchin's interpretation. The scholarly consensus is that the inscriptions are genuine, but the controversy is worth knowing about, because it illustrates something important about the pyramid's history. The gaps in our knowledge are large enough that the space between what we know and what we do not know is very easy to fill with whatever a particular writer wants to put there. The pyramid has attracted that kind of filling for as long as it has been studied. The discipline of staying with what the evidence actually shows, rather than what we would like it to show, is one that every generation of researchers has had to practice deliberately. What Weiss actually found is more interesting than the controversy around it. Those chambers were not designed to be seen. They were sealed in the pyramid during construction and no one was supposed to open them. They are rough and unfinished in a way that the public-facing spaces of the pyramid are not. They are backstage. The working parts of the structure, the spaces that kept the architecture standing without being part of what the architecture was meant to express. And they contain the names of the workers who placed the stones, scrawled in red paint by people doing a job and not imagining that anyone would ever read what they wrote. Those painted names are the ancient equivalent of a signature scratched into wet concrete. They say we were here. We did this. This is our work. 4,500 years later, we can read them. The next chapter in the interior's exploration came in 1993, when a German engineer named Rudolf Gantenbrink sent a small remote-controlled robot called Upuat, which means opener of the ways in ancient Egyptian, into the narrow shafts that run from the queen's chamber up through the body of the pyramid. These shafts had been known since the 1800s. They run at steep angles from the north and south walls of the queen's chamber. And parallel shafts run from the king's chamber as well. The king's chamber shafts open onto the exterior of the pyramid. The queen's chamber shafts do not. They stop somewhere inside the pyramid's body, at what the robot's camera would reveal to be small stone doors fitted with copper handles. Picture the moment the robot's camera reached the end of the southern shaft in March of 1993. The image it sent back showed something no one had expected. A smooth limestone slab, 2 copper fittings, the end of a passage that had not been opened since the pyramid was sealed. Gantenbrink knew immediately that what he was looking at was significant. He also knew that he did not have permission to go further. Going further without permission would end his access to the site permanently. So he stopped, published his findings, and waited 9 years. In 2002, a new robot was sent through the shaft. It drilled a small hole through the stone. A camera was inserted. On the other side was a small space, and on the far side of that small space was another door. That second door remains unopened. That image, a small space and another sealed stone slab, is a precise physical metaphor for what it means to study the Great Pyramid. Every answer reveals another question. Every open door shows you another door. The pyramid does not yield its interior the way a problem yields its solution. It yields it the way a conversation yields understanding. Gradually. Incompletely. With each new piece of information, raising questions that could not have been asked before. The researchers who came after Gantenbrink understood this. They came with better tools, tools that would have been unimaginable to everyone who had come before them. They came with the ability to see through stone without touching it. Chapter 4. The Men Who Looked for Rooms. There is a quality that every serious student of the Great Pyramid eventually develops. Whether they intend to or not, it is the quality of productive dissatisfaction. The sense that the official account, however carefully assembled, however well supported by the available evidence, is somehow shorter than the structure itself, that the pyramid contains more than the confirmed story has room for, that the picture is incomplete in a specific and important way, even if you cannot yet say precisely where the incompleteness lies. Sometimes that sense leads people astray. It leads them to fill the pyramid's silences with stories of their own making. Stories that feel true because the mystery is real, even when the proposed solution is not. And sometimes it leads them to something the evidence eventually confirms. The first person worth knowing about arrived at Giza in 1818. His name was Giovanni Battista Belzoni, and he was unlike anyone who had studied the pyramids before him. He was 6 feet 7 inches tall. He had worked as a strongman in London theaters. He had reinvented himself as an explorer in Egypt at a time when Egypt was newly accessible to Europeans. And he moved through the country with a confidence that was either extraordinary courage or an insufficient appreciation of the risks involved. Probably both. Belzoni had already discovered and entered several royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings when he turned his attention to the second pyramid on the Giza Plateau. The pyramid of Khufu's son Khafre, which had never been entered in the modern era. He spent weeks examining the pyramid's north face, looking for the hidden entrance. He found it, cleared the debris, blocking the passage, and descended into Khafre's burial chamber. The first thing he did when he got inside was look around in the torchlight, taking in a space that no modern person had entered before him. The second thing he did was write his name on the wall. Giovanni Belzoni. 1818. It is still there. His attempt to find additional spaces inside the Great Pyramid itself was less successful. He searched, found nothing new, and moved on. But what he left behind was not a discovery. It was a sensibility. The understanding that the pyramids rewarded persistent, physical, sometimes reckless engagement, and that the rewards, when they came, could be extraordinary. The sensibility shaped the next generation of explorers, including the man who brought the first serious scientific rigor to the problem. William Matthew Flinders Petrie arrived at Giza in 1880. He was 27 years old and largely self-taught, and he carried with him a set of measuring instruments that he had helped design and a commitment to precision that was, by the standards of the time, almost obsessive. Where previous visitors had estimated, Petrie measured. He spent months inside and around the pyramid, end quote, measuring everything he could reach. The length and width and height of every passage and chamber, the angle of every shaft, the dimensions of the sarcophagus in the king's chamber to within fractions of an inch, the spacing of the remaining casing stones on the pyramid's lower courses. Picture him in the king's chamber in the winter of 1880. In the light of an oil lamp, in the particular silence of a space that few people had entered, recording numbers in his notebook with the concentration of someone who understands that the numbers themselves are the discovery. Not what the numbers prove, what they reveal about the mind that planned them. His measurements established something that had been sensed before but never confirmed with precision. The pyramid's construction was not merely impressive in a general way. It was precise, in specific and deliberate ways that suggested intentions beyond the purely practical, the alignment to the cardinal directions accurate to within less than 1/10 of a degree. These were not the tolerances of people building as well as they could. They were the tolerances of people building to a standard that had been set in advance. A standard whose full meaning we have not yet recovered. Petrie published his findings in 1883 in a work called The Pyramids and Temples of Giza. He was careful throughout to distinguish between what the measurements showed and what they might mean. That distinction between what the evidence establishes and what we might wish it to establish is one that would not always be maintained by the people who came after him. In 1994, a writer named Robert Bauval published a book proposing that the layout of the 3 Giza pyramids was designed to mirror the pattern of the 3 stars in Orion's belt as they appeared in the night sky around 10,500 BCE. The theory generated enormous public interest and considerable academic skepticism, and the skepticism was not unfounded. The correlation requires adjustment to make the map and the sky align convincingly. And the theory is not accepted by mainstream Egyptology. It is a minority view, proposed by someone working outside the academic consensus. And it should be understood as such. What Bauval identified separate from the specific claims the evidence does not support, was that the pyramids builders were thinking about the sky, that the structure had cosmological intentions. That observation, stripped of the specific alignment theory, is one that serious Egyptologists share. The pyramid points north with an accuracy of less than 1/10 of a degree. The shafts in the king's chamber point toward stars that had religious significance in the Old Kingdom period. The relationship between the structure and the heavens was deliberate. The precise nature of that relationship is still being worked out. Rudolf Gantenbrink understood something of this when he designed his robot in 1993. He recognized that the shafts in the Queen's chamber were intentional features of the design, not accidental passages, and that what lay at the end of them mattered. His robot reached the sealed door and stopped at the limit of his permission. 9 years later, the door was drilled through and another door was found behind it. Mark Lehner, an American archaeologist who has spent decades at Giza and is among the most authoritative living scholars of the site, has framed the question of what the pyramid's interior means in terms that go beyond the simple tomb narrative. His work proposes that the pyramid should be understood as a technology for transformation, a structure designed to facilitate the pharaoh's passage from human existence to divine existence. Under Lehner's framing, the interior spaces are not storage facilities, but functional components of a machine whose purpose was cosmological. The shafts, the chambers, the precise astronomical alignments, all working parts of something designed to accomplish what the ancient Egyptians understood in terms we can only partially recover. That framing changes how we think about the corridor behind the chevron stones. It changes what we expect to find there. And it is the framing that the researchers who came next were working within when they pointed their instruments at the pyramid's north face and began to read what the stone was telling them. The tools they used were unlike anything Belzoni or Petrie or Gantenbrink had access to. They borrowed them from the sky itself. Chapter 4. The Men Who Looked for Rooms. There is a quality that every serious student of the Great Pyramid eventually develops, whether they intend to or not. It is the quality of productive dissatisfaction, the sense that the official account, however carefully assembled, however well supported by the available evidence, is somehow shorter than the structure itself. That the pyramid contains more than the confirmed story has room for. That the picture is incomplete in a specific and important way, even if you cannot yet say precisely where the incompleteness lies. Sometimes that sense leads people astray. It leads them to fill the pyramid's silences with stories of their own making. Stories that feel true because the mystery is real, even when the proposed solution is not. And sometimes it leads them to something the evidence eventually confirms. the first person worth knowing about arrived at Giza in 1818. His name was Giovanni Battista Belzoni, and he was unlike anyone who had studied the pyramids before him. He was 6 feet 7 inches tall. He had worked as a strongman in London theaters. He had reinvented himself as an explorer in Egypt at a time when Egypt was newly accessible to Europeans. And he moved through the country with a confidence that was either extraordinary courage or an insufficient appreciation of the risks involved. Probably both. Belzoni had already discovered and entered several royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings when he turned his attention to the second pyramid on the Giza Plateau, the pyramid of Khufu's son Khafre, which had never been entered in the modern era. He spent weeks examining the pyramid's north face, looking for the hidden entrance. He found it, cleared the debris blocking the passage, and descended into Khafre's burial chamber. The first thing he did when he got inside was look around in the torchlight, taking in a space that no modern person had entered before him. The second thing he did was write his name on the wall. Giovanni Belzoni, 1818. It is still there. His attempt to find additional spaces inside the Great Pyramid itself was less successful. He searched, found nothing new, and moved on. But what he left behind was not a discovery. It was a sensibility. The understanding that the pyramids rewarded persistent, physical, sometimes reckless engagement, and that the rewards, when they came, could be extraordinary. The sensibility shaped the next generation of explorers, including the man who brought the first serious scientific rigor to the problem. William Matthew Flinders Petrie arrived at Giza in 1880. He was 27 years old and largely self-taught, and he carried with him a set of measuring instruments that he had helped design and a commitment to precision that was, by the standards of the time, almost obsessive. Where previous visitors had estimated, Petrie measured. He spent months inside and around the pyramid, measuring everything he could reach, the length and width and height of every passage and chamber, the angle of every shaft, the dimensions of the sarcophagus in the king's chamber to within fractions of an inch, the spacing of the remaining casing stones on the pyramid's lower courses. Picture him in the king's chamber in the winter of 1880, in the light of an oil lamp, in the particular silence of a space that few people had entered, recording numbers in his notebook with the concentration of someone who understands that the numbers themselves are the discovery. Not what the numbers prove, what they reveal about the mind that planned them. His measurements established something that had been sensed before, but never confirmed with precision. The pyramid's construction was not merely impressive in a general way. It was precise in specific and deliberate ways that suggested intentions beyond the purely practical. The alignment to the cardinal directions accurate to within less than 1/10 of a degree. These were not the tolerances of people building as well as they could. They were the tolerances of people building to a standard that had been set in advance. A standard whose full meaning we have not yet recovered. Petrie published his findings in 1883 in a work called The Pyramids and Temples of Giza. He was careful throughout to distinguish between what the measurements showed and what they might mean. That distinction, between what the evidence establishes and what we might wish it to establish, is one that would not always be maintained by the people who came after him. In 1994, a writer named Robert Bauval published a book proposing that the layout of the 3 Giza pyramids was designed to mirror the pattern of the 3 stars in Orion's belt as they appeared in the night sky around 10,500 BCE. The theory generated enormous public interest and considerable academic skepticism, and the skepticism was not unfounded. The correlation requires adjustment to make the map and the sky align convincingly, and the theory is not accepted by mainstream Egyptology. It is a minority view, proposed by someone working outside the academic consensus, and it should be understood as such. What Bauval identified, separate from the specific claims the evidence does not support, was that the pyramid's builders were thinking about the sky. that the structure had cosmological intentions. That observation, stripped of the specific alignment theory, is one that serious Egyptologists share. The pyramid points north with an accuracy of less than 1/10 of a degree. The shafts in the king's chamber point toward stars that had religious significance in the Old Kingdom period. The relationship between the structure and the heavens was deliberate. The precise nature of that relationship is still being worked out. Rudolf Gantenbrink understood something of this when he designed his robot in 1993. He recognized that the shafts in the Queen's chamber were intentional features of the design, not accidental passage, and that what lay at the end of them mattered. His robot reached the sealed door and stopped at the limit of his permission. 9 years later, the door was drilled through and another door was found behind it. Mark Lehner, an American archaeologist who has spent decades at Giza and is among the most authoritative living scholars of the site, has framed the question of what the pyramid's interior means in terms that go beyond the simple tomb narrative. His work proposes that the pyramid should be understood as a technology for transformation, a structure designed to facilitate the pharaoh's passage from human existence to divine existence. Under Lehner's framing, the interior spaces are not storage facilities but functional components of a machine whose purpose was cosmological. The shafts, the chambers, the precise astronomical alignments, all working parts of something designed to accomplish what the ancient Egyptians understood in terms we can only partially recover. That framing changes how we think about the corridor behind the chevron stones. It changes what we expect to find there. And it is the framing that the researchers who came next were working within when they pointed their instruments at the pyramid's north face and began to read what the stone was telling them. The tools they used were unlike anything Belzoni or Petrie or Gantenbrink had access to. They borrowed them from the sky itself. Chapter 6. The corridor, behind the chevrons, stand at the base of the Great Pyramid's north face. Early morning. Before the heat builds, and before the tourist buses arrive, and before the vendors set up along the road below the plateau, the air at the base of the pyramid has a particular quality at that hour. Cool and still. Slightly damp with the night's condensation. The stone beneath your fingers is rough where the casing is gone. The raw limestone of the core blocks, exposed after millennia of wind and weather. Look up. The chevron stones are there. High above you, 2 enormous limestone slabs leaning against each other in the shape of an inverted V. Placed there 4,500 years ago by workers who had names and journals and families and an understanding of what they were building that we have not fully recovered. Every visitor who has ever approached this face of the structure has walked beneath them without knowing what was behind them. The chevron stones had always been assumed to serve a structural purpose. The engineering logic is sound. The pyramid uses the same architectural solution in other places where the weight above an open space needed to be redirected. 2 large stones, leaning against each other at the top, create a gabled form that distributes load outward rather than pressing it straight down onto the passage below. But structural purpose and intentional design are not mutually exclusive. The same stones can do 2 things at once. What the ScanPyramids team found, after months of collecting muon data from detectors placed against the pyramid's north face, was that the chevron stones stood in front of an unknown space. The muon data showed a region of anomalously high particle flux directly behind them, extending several meters into the pyramid's body. The signal was clear enough that the team was confident a void existed there. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed the presence of a space behind the stone's surface. Ultrasonic testing of the adjacent blocks confirmed that the space extended inward from the face. Muon detectors placed at different angles around the north face allowed the team to triangulate the approximate dimensions and orientation. What emerged from all of that data was a corridor, approximately 9 meters long, roughly 2 meters wide. Based on the detection data, a gabled ceiling formed by 2 large stone slabs leaning against each other. the same form as the relieving chambers above the king's chamber. The floor covered with sand. At the far end, a blocking stone, and beyond the blocking stone, the instruments suggested the presence of another space, though what that space was could not be determined from the outside. The team needed to get a camera inside. There was no entrance to the corridor that anyone could find. Its opening, if it had one, was hidden behind the chevron stones. Sealed, the same way the pyramid's original entrance had been sealed. What the team found, after careful examination of the stonework around the anomaly, was an existing gap between two limestone blocks near the base of the chevron stones. A joint between blocks wide enough to admit something very small. Wide enough for an endoscope 6 millimeters in diameter. The tube went through the gap and into the darkness beyond. The camera at its tip moved slowly forward, sending back images as it went. The floor came into focus first. Sand, fine and pale, lying in the gentle curves that sand forms when it has been settling for a very long time in a space with no air movement. Undisturbed. The kind of stillness that accumulates over centuries in a sealed space where no current moves and no hand has reached. 4,500 years of stillness. The walls came into view next. Rough limestone. Not smoothed or finished the way the public chambers of the pyramid are finished. Raw stone. The working face of the architecture rather than its public presentation. The surface that was never meant to be seen. The ceiling above was formed by two large stone slabs leaning against each other. Exactly as the muon data had predicted. The space they enclosed was tall enough that a person standing inside would not have had to duck. And at the far end of what the camera could reach, exactly where the data had said it would be, was a wall, a blocking stone, filling the end of the corridor completely. No gap visible. No joint wide enough to admit even the endoscope. Whatever lay beyond that wall was not accessible to the camera. The team published the endoscope images alongside the detection data in their Nature Communications paper. For the first time in modern history, images came back from inside a space that had been sealed since the pyramid was closed. The images confirmed what the instruments had suggested and added the details that only direct observation can provide. The sand on the floor was what stayed with the researchers afterward. Undisturbed sand is a kind of record. It tells you that the space has not been entered, that the air inside has not moved enough to disturb the fine particles lying on the floor. The last time anything moved in that corridor, the person who was inside it was walking out. The door was closing behind them. The pyramid was being sealed. Think of Mir on his boat, ferrying limestone across the Nile to the horizon of Khufu, writing his careful records, organizing his team on the transport runs he recorded. Somewhere in the years of that project, someone placed the stones that formed this corridor. Someone walked inside it for the last time. Someone sealed it. And then 4,500 years passed, and a camera 6 millimeters wide brought back the first images of what they left behind. The corridor has not been opened further. The Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities, which must approve any further investigation of the site, is engaged in ongoing conversation with the researchers about how to proceed without risking damage to a structure that has survived 4,500 years by being treated, in the modern era, with a degree of care that the explorers of the 19th century did not always practice. At some point, the blocking stone at the far end of the corridor may be examined more directly. What lies beyond it may be seen. When that happens, the answer may be extraordinary. It may be something that changes our understanding of the pyramid's interior in ways we cannot anticipate. It may be, as the pyramid so often produces, simply another question in the shape of an answer. But for now, the corridor is there, behind the chevron stones, filled with undisturbed sand, ending at a blocking stone behind which something waits in the dark. And that darkness has been unbroken since before the world the Greeks and Romans knew. Chapter 7. The empty heart of the matter. Picture the king's chamber, the way it actually is. Not the way it appears in illustrations. With dramatic lighting and implied grandeur. The way it actually is, when you climb up through the grand gallery and duck through the low entrance and stand inside for the first time. The room is smaller than you expect. The walls are polished red granite, fitted together with a precision that still produces a quality of stillness. A sense that the space has been sealed against something. The ceiling is flat granite. The floor is flat granite. The joints between the blocks are so tight that in most places you cannot insert a sheet of paper between them. And, in the center of the room, slightly to the west, is the sarcophagus. A rectangular box of dark granite, slightly too wide to have been brought through the ascending passage, which means it was placed here during construction, and the pyramid was built around it. It is undecorated. Its surface is plain and unmarked. No lid has been found, and whether one ever existed remains uncertain. It is empty. That emptiness has been confirmed since at least the 9th century, when Al-Mamun's workers entered the chamber and found it as it is today. Whether it was empty before that, whether it was ever not empty, is a question the evidence cannot answer with certainty. But here is what makes the emptiness strange. A sarcophagus is, by definition, a container. It is built to hold something. The Egyptians did not carve sarcophagi as decorative objects. In every other royal burial context we know of from ancient Egypt, the sarcophagus contains a body, or the remains of one, or, at minimum, traces of burial equipment. In cases where tombs were robbed in antiquity, the sarcophagus was found empty, but even then, traces remain. Fragments of wrappings, residues of the oils and resins used in mummification, splinters of wood from a coffin, something. The king's chamber sarcophagus shows none of that. It is not just empty. It is clean. The mainstream explanation is that the tomb was robbed so thoroughly and so long ago that every trace of its contents was removed. That is possible. It is even probable, given that virtually every other royal tomb in Egypt was robbed in antiquity. But it is not proven. The physical evidence inside the king's chamber does not confirm that a burial ever took place there. Now consider the walls. The king's chamber walls are entirely undecorated. Not a single hieroglyph, not a single painted image, not a single carved inscription anywhere in the king's chamber, or in the grand gallery that leads to it, or in the ascending passage. This requires careful framing. The tradition of inscribing pyramid interiors with religious texts, what scholars now call the pyramid texts, is first securely attested in the Pyramid of Unas, a pharaoh who ruled more than a century after Khufu. So comparing Khufu's pyramid directly to Unas's and calling the absence of texts in the older structure anomalous requires care. We cannot assume that the tradition existed in Khufu's time in the form it later took. What we can say is this: by later Old Kingdom standards, the silence of Khufu's pyramid feels striking. Whether the tradition had not yet fully developed in Khufu's time, or existed in a different form, spoken rather than written, performed in ritual rather than carved in stone, is a question the evidence leaves open. What is not open to question is that the absence is real, and that it has not been satisfactorily explained by any single theory. Mark Lehner, whose decades of fieldwork at Giza make him one of the most authoritative voices on the subject, has proposed that the pyramid should be understood not primarily as a tomb in the narrow sense, but as a technology for transformation, a structure designed to facilitate the pharaoh's passage from human existence to divine existence. Under this interpretation, the king's chamber was a space of ritual rather than storage. The sarcophagus may have served a ceremonial function during the funeral rites without necessarily being the permanent resting place of the mummy. The absence of texts was not a gap but a deliberate choice. perhaps because the transformation was meant to be accomplished through the architecture itself, through the precise alignment of the passages with the stars, through the movement of light and the geometry of stone. This interpretation does not contradict the mainstream consensus that the pyramid was associated with royal burial. It enriches it. It suggests that the word tomb, with its modern connotations of a place where a body is kept, may be too narrow, a translation of what the pyramid was meant to be. A more accurate word might be threshold, a place where the boundary between the human and the divine was located and could be crossed. That framing makes the empty sarcophagus less anomalous. It makes the bare walls less surprising, and it makes the sealed corridor behind the chevron stones, positioned at the threshold between the outside world and the pyramid's interior, considerably more interesting, because a threshold, by definition, is not about what is stored on one side of it. It is about what passes through. Chapter 8. The function we cannot agree on. What passes through a threshold depends entirely on what the threshold was built to serve. And that is the question that every serious student of the Great Pyramid eventually arrives at, usually after spending enough time with the evidence to understand that the standard answer is less settled than it appears. What was it for? Not, how was it built? Not who built it. Those questions have partial answers. Evidence-based answers that can be defended with reference to the physical record. The question of what the pyramid was for is different. It is a question about intention, about the inner life of a civilization that existed 4,500 years ago and left behind its greatest achievement, without leaving behind an unambiguous explanation of what that achievement was meant to accomplish. Before laying out the serious theories, it is worth being clear about one category of claims. Over the decades, various writers have proposed that the pyramid served functions entirely outside the framework of ancient Egyptian religion. These theories require the dismissal of the substantial body of evidence that connects the pyramid to the cultural and religious context of Old Kingdom Egypt. The workers' village, the papyrus of Merer, the mortuary complex surrounding the pyramid, the parallel structures built by Khufu's predecessors and successors. They are not supported by that evidence. They are proposed in spite of it. They belong in a different conversation from the one this story is having. The conversation this story is having is the one that takes the evidence seriously. And within that conversation, there is genuine and productive disagreement. The answer that most people carry is the tomb answer. The Great Pyramid was built as a tomb for the pharaoh Khufu. He commissioned it. His workers built it over approximately 20 years. When it was finished, his body was placed inside and the pyramid was sealed. And Khufu's spirit, guided by the rituals and the architecture and the precise astronomical alignments, made its journey from the human world to the divine one. That is the mainstream consensus. It is held by the majority of professional Egyptologists. It is supported by substantial circumstantial evidence. The pyramid is associated with Khufu by the inscriptions in the relieving chambers, by Merer's papyrus recording deliveries of stone to the site during Khufu's reign, and by the general pattern of Old Kingdom royal architecture, in which large pyramids formed the centerpieces of mortuary complexes. The tomb answer is not wrong to hold. But it does not yet explain completely. It does not explain the empty sarcophagus with no confirmed traces of burial. It does not explain the complete absence of inscriptions in the king's chamber, even accounting for the possibility that the pyramid text tradition had not yet fully developed in Khufu's time. It does not explain the sealed corridor behind the chevron stones, whose position and architecture do not obviously serve the function of a simple tomb. It does not explain the big void above the Grand Gallery, whose purpose remains entirely unknown. These are not small anomalies. They are structural features of the pyramid's design that the evidence has not yet fully accounted for, which is why other answers have been proposed. The most compelling alternative framing comes from Mark Lehner, Lehner does not reject the association between the pyramid and royal burial. What he proposes is a more complex understanding of what burial meant in the context of Old Kingdom Egyptian religion, an understanding in which the pyramid was not primarily a storage facility for a body, but a technology for transformation. In ancient Egyptian religious thought, death was not an ending. It was a transition. The pharaoh, at death, underwent a process of transformation from a human being into a divine being, joining the gods and, in some formulations, becoming identified with specific celestial entities. This transformation required the correct performance of rituals, the correct alignment of the burial space with the sky, and a physical structure whose geometry and orientation would create the conditions in which the transformation could occur. Under Lehner's interpretation, the pyramid was that structure. The king's chamber was not where the body was stored after the transformation. It was where the transformation happened. The precise north-south alignment of the pyramid, the shafts pointing toward specific stars, the mathematical relationships encoded in the proportions of the structure. All of these were functional features of a machine designed to accomplish something that the ancient Egyptians understood in terms we can only partially recover. This interpretation does not require abandoning the tomb hypothesis. It enriches it. The sealed corridor behind the chevron stones becomes more interesting under this framing. Its pose is shown directly behind the original entrance of the pyramid. At the threshold between the outside world and the interior, suggests a liminal function, a space associated with the crossing of a boundary. The chevron stones that conceal it are themselves a threshold marker, a pair of enormous stones shaped like an inverted V, the same form as the mountain hieroglyph that in ancient Egyptian writing represented the horizon, the place where the sun passes between the world of the living and the world of the dead. That may be coincidence. It may not be. Jean-Pierre Rodin, the French architect who proposed in 2007 that the pyramid was built using an internal spiral ramp running just inside the outer casing, arrived at his theory through a close reading of the architecture that convinced him the structure contained more empty space than the known chambers accounted for. His theory is primarily about construction rather than purpose, but its implication, that there are passages inside the pyramid that have not been found, is consistent with what the ScanPyramids team has since confirmed. What the evidence supports is something more interesting than certainty in either direction. The mainstream theories disagree with each other in productive ways. They are in conversation with the physical evidence. They change when new evidence arrives. The discovery of the corridor in 2023 will require all of them to be updated when the corridor is finally examined properly. That is what serious inquiry looks like, not the confident announcement of a final answer. An ongoing conversation between the evidence and the interpretation, in which each new piece of information creates the need for new understanding, and each new understanding suggests new things to look for in the evidence. The pyramid has been sustaining that conversation for nearly 2 centuries of modern archaeology. And the conversation, like the pyramid itself, shows no sign of ending. Chapter 9. The civilization that disappeared into its own achievement. The pyramid was still standing when the civilization that built it began to fall apart. That sentence deserves a moment before we move on, because it tells us something important about the relationship between achievement and durability, between the ability to build something extraordinary and the ability to sustain the conditions that made building it possible. The Great Pyramid was completed sometime around 2480 BCE. Near the beginning of what historians call the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom. For the century and a half that followed, Egyptian civilization continued at a high level of achievement. The successors of Khufu built their own pyramids on the Giza plateau. The administrative machinery that had made the pyramid possible continued to function. And then, By approximately 2150 BCE, the system began to dissolve, not abruptly, the way a building collapses, gradually, the way a tide goes out, leaving behind a landscape that looks almost familiar but is missing something essential. The process involved at least two interacting factors, one political and one environmental, working together in a way that neither alone would have been sufficient to cause. The political factor was structural. The Old Kingdom's administrative system had, over several generations, distributed power away from the central royal court and toward regional governors called nomarchs. These nomarchs controlled the agricultural surplus of their regions, raised their own armies, and in some cases passed their offices to their sons, creating hereditary local dynasties that operated with increasing independence from the central authority. This process was not dramatic. It happened through the normal workings of a patronage system in which the pharaoh rewarded loyal officials with land and titles and exemptions from taxation. And those officials did the same for their own subordinates. And over generations, the cumulative effect was to hollow out the central government's resources. By the end of the 6th dynasty, the last dynasty of the Old Kingdom, the pharaoh's ability to command the resources needed for large-scale projects had been significantly diminished. The pyramids built by 6th dynasty pharaohs are a fraction of the size of Khufu's pyramid. Their construction quality is dramatically lower. Some have largely collapsed, their interiors filled with the rubble of walls built too quickly from stone that was not adequate. The environmental factor arrived with less warning. Around 2200 BCE, give or take a few decades by most estimates, a climatic event occurred that affected civilizations across a vast geographic range. From Egypt to Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley, climate scientists call it the 4.2 kiloyear event. It was a period of severe and prolonged drought. The connection to the Old Kingdom's collapse is still being actively researched. But the coincidence in timing is striking, and the evidence for drought conditions in Egypt during this period is substantial. In Egypt, the event manifested as a dramatic reduction in the annual Nile flood. The Nile flood was the foundation of Egyptian civilization. Every year, the Nile rose and spread across the agricultural land on either side of its banks, depositing the rich silt that made those lands among the most productive in the ancient world. The timing and height of the flood determined the size of the harvest. The harvest determined how many people could be fed. How many people could be fed determined how many workers could be organized for the kinds of large-scale projects that had defined the Old Kingdom. When the flood failed repeatedly, the system strained in ways it had not been designed to handle. The texts from the period known as the First Intermediate Period, the era of fragmentation that followed the Old Kingdom's collapse, describe conditions that are difficult to read without feeling their weight. An official named Anktifi, who governed 2 provinces in Upper Egypt during this period, left inscriptions in his tomb describing famine conditions so severe that he claims to have fed his province while surrounding regions suffered. Whether his claims are literally true or shaped by the conventions of official self-promotion, they reflect real disruption. The archaeological record confirms a period of abandoned settlements, reduced agricultural output, and the breakdown of the administrative systems that had organized Egyptian life for centuries. And when those systems broke, something specific was lost that could not be recovered by putting the pieces back together. The specific organizational and technical conditions that had made Khufu's pyramid possible were no longer present. This is worth being precise about. It was not simply that the will to build was gone, or that the resources were unavailable. It was that the knowledge of how to do this specific thing had lived in people, in the craftsmen who had learned from the craftsmen before them, in an unbroken chain of transmission, stretching back to the men who had actually worked out the solutions to the problems the pyramid presented. When the chain broke, the knowledge did not go into a vault to be retrieved later. It simply was no longer there. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs who reunified Egypt after the First Intermediate Period tried to build pyramids. But the later Egyptian state did not reproduce what the Old Kingdom had built in quite the same form. The Middle Kingdom pyramids were built with rubble cores faced with limestone casing. They looked like pyramids from the outside. From the inside, they were, fundamentally, different structures. Less stable, less precise, less durable. Many have collapsed entirely. What remains of them today is often a shapeless mound of deteriorating stone, barely recognizable as the monument it was meant to be. Khufu's pyramid still stands. That contrast is one of the most striking demonstrations in the archaeological record of what it means for a civilization to lose specific technical knowledge. Not the loss of the desire to do something. Not the loss of the resources to attempt it. The loss of the accumulated understanding of how to do it. Understanding that had taken generations to develop and could not be reconstructed from scratch by people who had only the monument itself to study, with no access to the living tradition that had produced it. Think of Merer again, writing his careful records, organizing his team on the transport runs he recorded, moving through the logistics of a project that was, from inside, simply work. He was part of a chain of knowledge that stretched back generations before him and would, he had no reason to doubt, continue forward generations after him. It did not continue. Within a few generations of his working life, the administrative system he was part of would dissolve. The specific conditions that had made what he was doing possible would be gone. And the knowledge that lived in the people around him, the knowledge of how to build what was being built above him on the opposite bank of the Nile, would not survive the disruption intact. He did not know that. He just did his job. He kept his records. He delivered his stone to the horizon of Khufu. And the pyramid held what it held, including a sealed corridor that no one would find for 4,500 years. Chapter 10. What we are still looking for. The last image the endoscope sent back before it was withdrawn was of the blocking stone at the far end of the corridor. Pale limestone, smooth-faced, no visible joint or gap. The wall that ends the 9-meter passage completely, behind which the detection data suggests the presence of another space. Though what that space contains cannot be determined from the outside. That image is where the confirmed story of the corridor ends, and where the ongoing work begins. The ScanPyramids team has not stopped. The conversations between the researchers and the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities about how to proceed are ongoing. The analysis is still being refined and deepened by improved processing methods applied to data already collected. The Big Void, announced in 2017, remains one of the most significant unresolved findings in the history of pyramid research. A space at least 30 meters long, above the Grand Gallery, confirmed by 3 independent detection methods. Its exact shape is not fully characterized. Its ceiling height is not known. Its relationship to the Grand Gallery below it and to the corridor behind the chevron stones has not been determined. Most importantly, its purpose remains entirely unknown. Subsequent analysis of the muon data, using improved processing methods developed after the initial publication, has suggested that the Big Void may not be a single large chamber, but a more complex space. Possibly a series of connected areas whose geometry is not yet fully resolved. If it is a corridor or series of connected spaces rather than a single room, the question becomes where those spaces lead and how they connect to the rest of the pyramid's interior. That question does not yet have an answer. The technology available to ask it is improving. Muon detection systems have become significantly more sensitive since 2015. New configurations of detectors placed at positions not yet used by the ScanPyramids team could produce higher resolution images of the pyramid's interior. Ground-penetrating radar systems that can achieve greater depth and finer resolution than was possible a decade ago are being applied to the Giza Plateau on an ongoing basis. Not just to the Great Pyramid, but to the ground beneath the plateau itself. Mehrer wrote about the infrastructure that made the pyramid possible, the routes and the schedules and the systems that kept the stone moving from quarry to river to site. Most of what he described physically. The harbor that received the stone, the roads that carried it, the administrative centers that coordinated the work, is still in the ground somewhere, and archaeologists are still looking for it. Each new season at Giza has the potential to add another piece to a picture that is more complete than it was a generation ago, but still far from whole. And in archives and libraries where ancient Egyptian texts are studied, work continues on, understanding the religious and cosmological beliefs of the Old Kingdom period. Scholars working on the oldest layers of the pyramid texts are finding connections between the architectural choices made at Giza and the religious understanding of the period that earlier scholarship had not fully articulated. Architecture and text together tell a story that neither can tell alone. Right now, as you listen to this, particles from outer space are passing through the pyramid's stones, muons, falling from the sky in their steady, constant rain, carrying information about the interior of the structure through 2 million blocks of ancient rock. They do not stop at night. They do not wait for researchers to be present. They fall through the pyramid the way they have fallen through it for thousands of years, reading it in a language that took us until the 21st century to learn to translate. And somewhere in what they are carrying, behind the blocking stone, at the end of the corridor, is something that has not been seen. We are still learning to read it. Chapter 11. The corridor and the question it is shaped like. There is something that human beings do that no other animal appears to do. We build things that are not for survival. Not directly. Not in the way that a beaver builds a dam or a bird builds a nest. We build things whose relationship to the immediate needs of staying alive and staying warm is indirect at best, and in many cases, non-existent. We build things whose purpose is to mean something, to say something, to connect the people who build them to something larger than the practical requirements of a human life. The site of Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey contains stone enclosures built by hunter-gatherers around 11,500 years ago. People who had not yet invented agriculture, people who had not yet made pottery. And yet they organized themselves to quarry and shape and erect T-shaped limestone pillars up to 20 feet tall, carving them with detailed images of animals and abstract forms, arranging them in patterns whose full significance we can only partially guess at. Not a shelter, not a storage facility, something meant to mean something to the people who gathered inside it. On the Giza Plateau, around 2500 BCE, the people of the Old Kingdom built a structure so large and so precise that 4,500 years later, we are still finding things inside it that we did not know were there. The impulse behind both structures is the same. The impulse to mark something, to make something permanent out of something that would otherwise pass without a trace, to reach across time in a way that the ordinary activities of a human life, the eating and sleeping and working and loving and grieving and dying, do not allow. The Great Pyramid is the most extreme expression of that impulse in the ancient world. It was built to last. Not in the way that a practical building is built to last, with the expectation that it will be maintained and eventually replaced. It was built with the intention of lasting forever, of being there not just for the lifetime of the pharaoh who commissioned it, not just for the duration of the civilization that built it, but for as long as stone exists and gravity holds and the desert remains. That intention raises a question the archaeology alone cannot answer. Why did they need it to last forever? What were they trying to preserve? The mainstream answer says that what they were trying to preserve was the pharaoh's journey to the divine realm, the conditions necessary for his spirit to complete its transformation. The pyramid was not built for eternity in general. It was built for a specific eternal moment, the moment of transformation, which the structure was designed to enable and to protect. That answer is coherent. It fits the evidence better than the alternatives. And it opens onto a question that is not historical. The question of what happens to a person after they die is not something the people of the Old Kingdom invented. It is not something they had a monopoly on asking. It is the question that has been asked in every culture that has left any record of itself. Since the first human being stood at the edge of that particular darkness and understood, for the first time, what it contained, the ancient Egyptians asked it with stone. With 2.3 million blocks of precisely placed stone, aligned to the cardinal directions with an accuracy of less than 1/10 of a degree. Enclosing chambers whose walls were left bare, and a sarcophagus whose lid has never been found. And a sealed corridor behind 2 enormous limestone slabs that no person has physically stepped inside in 4,500 years. The corridor is shaped like a question. Not because it is dramatic or mysterious in the way that popular accounts require mystery to be. Because it is the physical residue of people who took seriously, with the full weight of their organizational capacity and their technical knowledge and 20 years of sustained labor, the question of what a human life means and where it goes when the body that carried it is gone. We cannot share their answer. The cosmological framework within which the pyramid made sense as a technology for transformation is not available to us in its original form. What we have are fragments. The papyrus of Merer, the inscriptions in the relieving chambers, the architecture itself, the detection data that has shown us spaces we did not know existed, the endoscope image of undisturbed sand on the floor of a sealed corridor. But the question underneath the answer is available to us. It is ours as much as it was theirs. And the corridor, sealed and patient and waiting in the dark behind the chevron stones, is shaped exactly like that question. Not like the answer. Like the question. That is enough. For tonight, that is enough. Chapter 12. The Sealed Corridor. Revisited. Come back to the north face of the pyramid. Before dawn. When the plateau is quiet and the stars are still visible above the desert and the pyramid is a shape against the sky. A darker darkness within the darkness. Present and massive and still. Stand at the base of the north face and look up. The chevron stones are there above you. Invisible in the dark. But there, 2 enormous limestone slabs leaning against each other in the shape of a V. Placed there 4,500 years ago by workers who had names and families and journals and an understanding of what they were building that we have not fully recovered. One of them was Merer, or someone like Merer. Someone who kept careful records and organized his team on the transport runs. He recorded and delivered his stone to the horizon of Khufu and wrote it all down in a journal that would survive in a sealed cave on the coast of the Red Sea, long enough for us to read it. Someone who stood, perhaps, where you are standing now, and looked up at what was rising above him on the opposite bank of the Nile, and felt something that his journal was not designed to record. Behind those stones is a corridor, 9 meters long, a floor covered with sand that has not been disturbed since the pyramid was sealed. A ceiling formed by 2 large limestone slabs leaning against each other in the same form as the stones outside. Walls of rough limestone that were never meant to be seen. At the far end of the corridor, a blocking stone. And, behind the blocking stone, something. We do not know what it is. We have looked at it with particles from outer space and with a camera 6 millimeters wide and with the best instruments the 21st century has produced. And what we know is that it is there. And that it has been there. Undisturbed and unchanged. Since before the world the Greeks and Romans knew. That is not a small thing to know. In a world that changes with a speed that makes the 5-year-old version of almost anything feel obsolete, the existence of a sealed space that has not been entered or altered since before writing was widespread is a fact of almost incomprehensible rarity. Most things do not last. The boats that carried Merer's limestone across the Nile have rotted away. The ropes used to haul the stones up the ramps have long since decomposed. The tools, the sledges, the surveying methods, and the accumulated expertise that allowed the builders to achieve what they achieved at Giza. Most of the physical traces of all of that are gone. What lasted is the stone. And inside the stone, the corridor. And inside the corridor, the sand. And at the end of the corridor, the blocking stone. And behind the blocking stone, something that the people who built the pyramid chose to seal away and leave no record of anywhere we have found. At some point, perhaps soon, perhaps years from now, the blocking stone at the far end of the corridor may be examined more directly. A method will be proposed. A decision will be made. And what lies beyond that wall may be seen for the first time. It may be a small space that served a structural purpose, empty of artifacts, offering no new information about the pyramid's design or the beliefs of the people who built it. A door. And behind it, another question. It may be something that changes the picture entirely. An inscription that has waited 4,500 years for someone to read it. An object that has sat in the dark since before Rome was founded. A connection to the big void above the grand gallery that begins to reveal the logic of an interior we have only partially understood. Or it may be, as the pyramid so often produces, something between those two possibilities. An answer that is also a question. Something that confirms what was suspected while opening a door onto something else we had not known to look for. Whatever it is, the corridor will still have been there, sealed and patient, filled with undisturbed sand, holding its darkness for 4,500 years while the world above it changed beyond recognition. The pyramid has been patient. The corridor has been patient. The sand on its floor has been patient. We can be patient too. The Great Pyramid was built by human beings. Not by forces beyond our understanding. By human beings. With hands and minds and the accumulated knowledge of a civilization at the height of its powers. By workers who had names we will never know, and families we will never be able to trace, and a daily experience of moving through the world that was, in all the ways that matter, as vivid and complete and urgent as our own. By a man named Mirror, who kept his journal carefully and delivered his stone accurately and used a name for what he was building that pointed not towards storage or burial, but towards something crossing a boundary. A horizon, a threshold, a place where something passed from one state of existence to another. They sealed it. They walked away. Time covered their tracks. The centuries came and went, and the corridor waited. It is still waiting tonight. Let your breathing slow. The pyramid is still there when you close your eyes. 2.3 million stones, fitted together with a level of planning and precision that still demands explanation. Enclosing spaces that held their secrets for 4,500 years and are only now beginning to speak. Right now, as you drift toward sleep, particles from the sky are passing through the pyramid stones. Muons, falling in their steady constant rain. Carrying information about what lies inside through 2 million blocks of ancient rock, they pass through the corridor. They pass through the sand on its floor. They pass through the blocking stone and into whatever lies beyond it. Reading what is there the way we are only beginning to learn to read it. The pyramid is still being read. The story is not finished. Think of Mirror on his boat, the limestone loaded, the Nile moving beneath him, the horizon of Khufu rising on the opposite bank. Stone by stone, day by day, towards something he understood better than we do, and that we are still trying to recover. He did not know we would still be here. He just did his job. Sleep well. Dream of what remains. The corridor will still be there in the morning. Good night.